And now I'd like to invite our third speaker, Dr. Andrew Wyatt, addressing also the coastal squeeze with, of course, the hybrid nature-based solutions.
Thank you. I promise, I don't see Professor Chi here, so he doesn't have to suffer these set of slides again, because actually I'm going to retire this set of slides after this forum is over. I've been recycling this set of slides since 2020, so my apologies. And Dr. Chi knows that very well. I probably rolled these slides out 3 or 4 times every year since 2020. But it's a set of slides that were used for advocacy with particularly the provincial governments in the Mekong Delta, and then the ministries, but also the communities in the coastal provinces of the Delta. Since we turned our focus to working in the coastlines where the coastal squeeze phenomenon was taking place. And this was after already 12 years of working in the public forests in Can Tho province on the inland integrated mangrove shrimp systems, where we were working with the forest management boards. That was a very different land tenure context, whereby the government owned that land and then leased it out to households. And that landscape, as for those of you who know Can Tho, consisted of a huge, around about 70,000 hectares of mangroves growing inland up to 10 to 15 kilometers, right? So that's very different to the rest of the Mekong Delta's coastline, probably around about 500, about 2/3 of the coastline, which is characterized by private land holdings along the coastline. And that's what poses a challenge in terms of the coastal resilience of that kind of coastline, because the land use was dominated by agricultural activities that had long cleared that the original mangroves that used to be on that land. They date back even to the French colonial times, with the expansion of rice and then later on shrimp farming, right? So that's the coastal landscape that I'm going to be talking about the coastal squeeze. Again, these slides were more or less designed to, at provincial level. It's dated, so my apologies. A lot of data in here is a little bit outdated. But I was also asked to talk about how we're helping communities and the government, and how we're working with donors to address the challenge in this landscape. So let me just go back to start off with this slide. This is what we also use to leverage our advocacy with the government in terms of what they had to address in the coastal areas of the Mekong Delta. And for those of you who know, this report came out in 2019. If you do a word count in this document, the coastal squeeze actually comes up around about 40 times in this document. So it was the first high-level IPCC policy document that really brought out the issue of the coastal squeeze and alerted governments around the world that they needed to address this issue. And that top quotation, the clause A6.3, was a very good definition of the coastal squeeze related to the impacts of sea level rise which would impact coastal ecosystems through habitat contraction, through which we'll lose biodiversity and ecosystem functionality because of the anthropogenic barriers that prevent landward shift of the marshes and mangroves. Of course, the marsh experience comes from the US, the Florida Keys, and so on, the Mississippi Delta. What was very useful here was to inform the Vietnamese government was this particular assumption, and that was that it was highly dependent on the geomorphology and sediment supply as to whether marshes and mangroves could keep up with sea level rise. Because there was always an assumption here, and we knew this through the engagement of provincial governments along the coast, that there was an assumption that if you plant the mangroves, they would automatically trap the sediment and you would respond to sea level rise. Of course, this is what the document did, was to alert us that this really depended on the geomorphology and the sediment supply. And that's what we tried to reinforce through our advocacy. And that this favorable geomorphology, in other words, the slope and elevation of the mudflats and the sediment supply, doesn't actually hold. It's an assumption doesn't actually hold in the large parts of the Mekong Delta's coastline. This is a graphic I pinched from a textbook, ecology textbook, and I think I'm not going to talk too much about this, but I think the pointer is not working, sorry. I've hacked this diagram at the bottom here to just add in the Mekong Delta context, whereby we have this agricultural land use, intensive shrimp farming behind the seawall, so that's that anthropogenic barrier of the seawall and the intensive shrimp farming. Other parts of the coastline, we also have intensive rice, like Kinjang province, for example. And in front of the sea dike, in the mudflats, we have sediment depletion from upstream dams and sluice gates. Behind the sea dike, in the intensive shrimp farming, we've got groundwater pumping and subsidence, which then extends past the shoreline out into the mudflats. Okay? Altogether, this contributes to the acceleration of the coastal squeeze that's currently ongoing in the delta. I often use this graphic also to show that without anthropogenic barriers, the mangroves have actually retreated and come back over geological timescales, right? So that dotted line there shows where the mangroves once were 4,500 years before present. So without those anthropogenic barriers, they would have moved inland with sea level rise. I also often present this slide because there's a fundamental misunderstanding about mangrove ecology as well. Making the point here that mangroves in the delta are often not able to take root today. And I would say that this has been through our experience with mangroves in the delta over the last 15 years since we started working on mangroves here, that it was already not possible to plant mangroves as far back as 10 to 15 years ago along large stretches of the coastline. And that's a combination of several factors, of course. We have sea level rising. That's probably the least, the parameter that's affecting the issue the least. But the major, of course, is the sediment supply, as our previous presentations have already outlined. The mudflats are subsiding, so changing the elevation, which is a combination of natural and anthropogenic subsidence. And therefore, they can't migrate upland and inland because of the sea dikes and the agricultural land use barrier. I also often use this reference, for which there are a number of Vietnamese authors in key research institutes in in Vietnam as a piece of advocacy. But I refer to this particular reference because it also not only identifies sediment loss from the dams and sand mining, but also that the irrigation systems in the delta itself had a role to play to divert sediments away from the coast, leading to long-term sediment decline. Also, I've been promoting this document, for which Mark Gauchot is a co-author, one of the lead co-authors in this document, and we are to thank him and Edward Int'l for this publication to correct this kind of misunderstanding that planting mangroves, would trap sediment. But this document was designed and in fact to rectify that kind of misunderstanding, and that is we have to have the sediment first before we can actually have mangroves. And therefore, your assessments, your site assessments of mangrove interventions for conservation or restoration purposes need to look at different scales of analysis, and this particular document actually provides a rapid assessment methodology at the end in the annex that starts at the river basin scale in terms of sediment supply and so on. I'm already running out of time, so I'm going to go very quickly. I'm not going to dwell on this. This is old data. The sediment loss, you've already seen some data on that. Majority of coastal loss of mangroves is related to coastal erosion, no longer cutting. I also show our provinces who are not often aware of this decision support tool called the Coastal Protection Portal to show historical coastlines which have been retreating here since 1965, in fact, on this coastline of the former Sok Chang and Bak Lieu coastline. I often show them the critical coastal squeeze locations and the kind of characteristics of these coastal squeeze locations: high erosion rates, sediment deficits, subsidence. The previous presentation on salinity intrusion pointed out aquaculture losses. Every time we have an El Nino, we suffer huge amounts of losses in the aquaculture, and their response is to pump groundwater as a result. And of course, these are very old slides from the Rise and Fall project and Minderhood's PhD. I often complain to him, what happened to the contours beyond the shorelines? Because I've argued that's been misleading. It's not that the subsidence ends at the shoreline, it extends out beyond the shorelines as well. That leads to the coastal squeeze. Since then, we've tried to actually measure the actual sediment rather than model it. And only one of that, the very last one, has actually measured subsidence on the shoreline itself. So we don't have a lot of data on that. I often remind them that the Typhoon Linda, and often provincial officials and communities have actually forgotten the fact that we lost 200,000 homes along the coastline through the storm surge that occurred from Typhoon Linda, which measured from 1 meter at Kamau down to 0.8 meters at Sok Chang. Okay, I'm moving on. Some cases of the pictures of the coastal squeeze in Sok Chang province, the former Sok Chang province. 2 kilometers of private land use intensive shrimp farming inland. That's what that particular coastline looks like. Enterprise level shrimp farming mixed with household level farming. And this has been a government response since probably 2018, when the first concrete wave breakers started to go in, protect the shorelines. Just going to skip through this. Our advocacy has argued that a sectoral planning, largely the government has focused on a sectoral planning approach. But an integrated planning approach would look at land use behind the sea dikes. And these have been the interventions that we've been working on behind the sea dikes, and that is to advocate for an expanded solution space or setback zone, including mangroves, and mixing it with technology like recirculating aquaculture systems, mixed mangrove shrimp systems with RAS, recirculating aquaculture systems, both for communities and small, medium enterprises. It's not a new idea. The Dutch Mekong Delta Plan had already proposed some kind of setback zone. And let me just skip through this. Just tell you about the IUCN project to help to work with the communities. We have $1 million generous donation grant from the Coca-Cola Foundation to assist communities to try to incentivize them to plant mangroves behind the sea dikes. And we started in January with the first batch of 10 farms in Sok Chang. We already had a second batch of farm designs to incentivize farmers to plant mangroves in their intensive shrimp farms. We're just getting, there was a first batch, and we're just getting the crop results, the first crop results out. I can't show it, I won't show it to you now, I don't have time. That's what one of these redesigned farms look like. We'll have some of the economic and the water conservation, therefore stopping the groundwater pumping, results out within the next quarter. They're going through some analysis at present. There's some examples at enterprise level, mix of using mangroves with RAS systems from Rheinland. He's our business champion. And just, I want to finish off with this set of slides to tell you how we've been working with the government. Of course, the government has been working on the concrete breakwaters in front of the sea dikes because the soft engineering, the pioneering soft engineering approach no longer work that were pioneered by GIZ, and we worked with them through until they finished in 2018 to advocate for these soft engineering approaches. But the amount of sediment to trap today is much reduced, extremely low. It used to take just 6 months to 1 year to fill a bamboo T-fence that GIZ had pioneered. Today, that's the first pilot concrete breakwater at Sok Chang that was built in 2021. It took 3 years to fill that particular breakwater with sediment, and they were able to then replant the mangroves. This is a new, the bottom one, that's a new breakwater going to Bucklew in the south. There's no sediment in that. So there are some questions about whether there's enough sediment to trap. And just early this year, we worked with the Southern Institute Water Resource Planning to go and evaluate the effectiveness of those breakwaters, and also to look at the landscape behind the sea dikes to introduce them to our COPE project with the hybrid solutions. You can have a look at this. Just finally, with the donors, back in 2021, we made a joint commitment to actually intervening in those landscapes behind the sea dikes. And it took a while for us to source the funding to do those demonstrations, for example, from Coca-Cola Foundation. And actually now we're working to prepare a GCF that will use the results from those hybrid nature-based solutions, together with the kind of flood-based agriculture that Mark had also presented. And WWF are working with us with generous co-financing to prepare a GCF concept note to actually fund these kinds of interventions. And it's actually co-funding to a World Bank loan that's being designed at present, and it's referred to the Merit project. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew.